Welcome to Belonging Reimagined. I'm your host, Dr. Mona. As a mental health therapist, professor, and researcher, I guide folks in owning their belonging journey and exploring barriers to belonging. In this podcast, I explore real stories with phenomenal guests about how to experience both interconnection and interdependence. And my hope for you is that you learn ways to experience more connection in the world around you and the world within yourself. We don't have to do this life thing alone. You're right where you belong. Today, we have Corinne Hudson on the show, and this is a really unique topic that I'm excited to talk about in relation to belonging, and we're going to get into it. So Corinne is a licensed marriage and family therapist, a Reiki practitioner, and a yoga teacher. Woo! You're hitting all the marks there. You're hitting all the marks there. And so with this being your professional identities, Corinne, we're going to talk about pleasure and belonging. Mm-hmm. And I know a lot of thoughts come up for folks when we talk about pleasure. But when you reached out and said that you wanted to explore this topic on the show, I was like, ooh, that certainly piqued my interest. And so I'd love to hear from you more about how your own personal and even your professional journeys led you to explore and to study the topic of pleasure.
Yes. Well, I'm really excited to be here and grateful to be here. I love the podcast and I love the concept of understanding the multiple identities that lead to belonging. I love the belonging platform and the model that you created. So just wanted to give you your flowers. But as far as my journey, I would say that I've always been a very curious child. I am a double Gemini, sun and moon. And so I've always been very curious about sex, to be honest, and just pleasure and exploring the body. I was blessed and lucky enough to have a very strong influence in my mother, who was always very open with me about her own pleasure and pleasure in general and being comfortable and exploring that. And throughout my teenage years, I just ended up always being, I think a lot of therapists relate to this, the therapist of your friends. People can easily talk to you and come to you and they bring you their things. And so it took me a while because I think for a long time, I knew I wanted to somehow learn more about sexuality and spirituality, or blend the two worlds in some way, shape, or form. And so I was looking maybe at like a doctoral program for research on like the energetics of sex or like human sexuality. And it took me a good solid, mid-20s to finally find a licensed marriage and family therapy track. And I could do couples work and sex therapy. And so in that, I just, dove into the world of couple therapy and did a lot of my own research actually on sex therapy. But, I started to get more and more curious about the actual concept of pleasure, right? And like the actual concept of experiencing pleasure and sensuality and beyond just a sexual nature. And so once I became licensed, I found my way to getting my registered yoga registered yoga teacher training, completed that. Again, just thinking, I'm only going to use this for clients, but it completely radicalized me and transformed me and helped me get even more into my body, which then made me think, there's actually a pleasure identity. Like you really have to be open to exploring what that looks like and not, your sexual identity or your gender identity, but really like your pleasure identity. And so I've been really playing around with that myself and learning about that myself. And it led me to deepening work within the Reiki world and becoming a Reiki practitioner to explore kind of the energetic pieces of pleasure and the energetic pieces of sensuality. And again, had this transformative moment of learning myself and wanting to then help other people learn themselves and work with themselves. And so I think when you and I first met, we talked a lot about human design and that we both are 2 5s, which is such a rare profile line. But we have these innate gifts to be able to help people and call things out and help people learn things in a new way. And so when I've been a therapist for almost 3 years now, and earlier this year, I said, you know what, I think I'd like to find ways to incorporate some of my intuitive gifts in this as well. And that led me to opening up my own business called Flowering Heart Wellness, which is just a place for people to explore self-expansion, embodiment. And, you know, a piece of that is what I call systemic pleasure. And being an MFT, our whole world is all about systems, right?
Yeah.
The systems of the person, the systems of, you know, the things that influence the person, things that influence a couple. And so I took that concept of looking beyond just, you know, one thing and looking at the layers of something and integrating that into learning about systemic pleasure, looking at pleasure just beyond a sexual orgasmic space and looking at it in the systems of your life, you know, mental pleasure, emotional pleasure, spiritual pleasure, you know, really diving into the world of sensuality and, you know, exploring what it looks like for you to be a soul-centered pleasure. You know, who are you at your core? Who are you in your soul? And so I just thought, you know, when I listened to one of the first podcast that I listened to that really hit me for you was this belonging and workplace trauma one. And I was like, oh, this is it. So I've been following all along. And, you know, when we talked, it was like, no, you know, pleasure is a part of our identities, you know, and if we can find some rooting in that, I think we can find that community where we explore pleasure. We can find that personal pleasure. We can find that, you know, even generational exploration of pleasure and shifting that from what we traditionally know about pleasure and sensuality.
So you've touched on this, but what does systemic pleasure mean to you? What does that term mean?
At this point in my life, systemic pleasure means to take it beyond the body and take it beyond just the senses. And so, you know, what are ways that you can incorporate pleasure into your life in your day to day, right? And I'm not just talking about touch. I'm talking about I go for a walk and I get to interact and connect with the trees on an energetic level. And that is pleasing to me. I work really hard to open my throat chakra and speak my truth. And that is influential in my community. And through influencing my community, now I have rooting there, and that's pleasing to me. You know, I honor my intuitive gifts, and I honor and do the work of not holding on to generational trauma or learning about myself. And that is pleasing to me. So systemic pleasure, taking it outside of just, you know, like I said, orgasmic pleasure or sexual pleasure, and looking at all the different layers in your life where you can apply this idea of being able to be pleased. And a lot of this is rooted in the senses and the body. So one of the examples I use is that, you know, when you eat your favorite meal, right? And you end up doing that little jig that you do, that happy dance in your body, right? That is pleasure, right? You're not necessarily having an orgasm, but you are enjoying this and having a moment of full embodiment. When you have that really good catch up with your friends and you kind of feel like, oh, I feel so seen, I feel so heard, and it feels good. That is pleasure. You know, when you accomplish that feat and you push yourself to achieve that goal, even though you are fearful of it, the other side of that is really being able to see your own self and to be able to know that you can do these new things. And that is pleasure. And so just looking at it through all the layers of our lives and through all the different systems of our lives outside of just some sensuality.
I really relate so much to what you're talking about in terms of having these questions and curiosity about sex and sexual pleasure and sensual pleasure. And that sensual part for me has been especially pertinent. I think also being autistic, that has been something that has been of note, I should say, in my life. Like I like my fuzzy blankets and I like things that soothe the five senses or something that really help regulate my emotions for me, and also just psychologically for me, and energetically, and even spiritually for me. I can get very calm and centered when I have sensory systems are soothed. So
Yeah.
that is something that really, really resonates with me. But I love this idea that you're talking about how pleasure occurs across different systems. Because I think oftentimes we think of pleasure as almost like this dopamine rush, right? We can think of pleasure
Yeah.
as
Yeah.
almost like pathological in some ways. And I love the way
Mm,
that you really add this beautiful wrapping around it and uplift pleasure as something that can help us be like really rooted in the human experience. And when we're rooted in the human experience, part of that is being really deeply connected with others and with ourselves. That's what being
mhm,
human is about,
mhm.
you know, a
Yeah.
large part of what being human is about, in other words. So I love this idea of systemic pleasure because it really touches all of the aspects of belonging and the life spaces of belonging, as you mentioned, in that belonging
Mm,
integration life map, where we're looking at the different spaces where belonging occurs, is also where
right.
pleasure can occur. Because when we have
Yeah.
belonging, we also are experiencing a certain level of pleasure or a certain kind of pleasure in that.
I think that's one of the most underrated pieces of pleasure is when we find that opportunity to be, whether it's in community, even like I said, within ourselves, that good girl chat where it's like, oh, the joke is like, I feel alive again after having that group hang out, right? But it truly is because you are so within your body and you are so grounded within who you are that you can take the moment to just be, just be here and experience and feel how good it feels to be in that community and to be seen. And I think, we live in a society currently where we're all in our heads, right? We're constantly thinking. And one of the things I love about human design and, this idea of systemic pleasure in general is that it brings us into our minds and it brings us into wisdom. Our bodies hold so much wisdom for us. And I think we go throughout our lives being separated in it. And like I said, currently in my time in my life, I'm really learning how to be in my body and be, like you said, sensual in that way. And not just, again, sensuality is often linked with sex and, orgasms, but it's really, like you said, this is my good blanket that I love. And just even touching this blanket helps me be present. I'm able to live again. I can hear people in a new way, like I'm like, oh yes, okay, I can settle. My nervous system is calm and regulated. So a lot of systemic pleasure is also developing a relationship with your nervous system and, not necessarily learning how to be soothed all the time, because that's just unfortunately not the world that we live in. But it is in the relationship with like, okay, my nervous system is providing me this information, right? So I can take this, I can process it, I can now listen and kind of say, okay, what are you trying to tell me? Right? Like I am safe. I'm good. Okay. So I need to rest. Okay. Got you. All right. Do I need to communicate with my friends? Do I need to, feed myself something good and nurturing and warm? Do I need to go for a walk? And so, this piece of really bringing it back into the body to learn how to increase that pleasure and to learn how to work with the true senses, all of the senses, and not just touch, to be able to learn how to really trust yourself and develop that relationship with yourself.
Oh, that is so beautifully said, though. There's so much wisdom in our bodies. I never
Mm-hmm.
thought of it like that before. It's a really
Hmm.
interesting way to perceive ourselves and uplift the way that we perceive ourselves, because it's so true. It's so true.
Mm-hmm.
Our bodies tell us when we're
Mm-hmm.
hungry. Our bodies tell us when we're too hot, when we're too cold. It tells us when we need to take a break. It tells us when we're overwhelmed. It tells us when we feel desire, towards someone or
Yes.
something or some life
Yes.
calling, or some
Yes.
food, right? And so that leads me though, thinking about like some food, because of course I went straight to French fries and ice cream in my mind, right? So it leads me to think about like
Mm-hmm.
some pleasurable activities are really healthy for our overall well-being. And others
Yes.
are not, right? Like when I start thinking about some
Yeah.
of those certain
Yes.
foods that do bring me a certain kind of pleasure. And so what do you think is a healthy relationship with pleasure, and how can we be aware of whether or not our relationship with pleasure is healthy or not?
Mm. I had a lot of years where I started to gain weight and I just hung up the phone on the information from my body to the point where I just kind of ate to numb myself. I really didn't feel, I wasn't in my body. I was doing things because I knew that as a human, I technically needed to do these things to move forward and to continue to go forward. So yeah, I ate, I drank my water. I would overconsume or I would underconsume and not feed myself and starve myself or, restrict. And so I think some of this is looking at the both and, right? Yes, there are beautiful things to eat in this world, like French fries and chocolate and a really good peach milkshake.
That's very
And,
specific, Corinne.
there are, I know, I'm thinking about it. And, I want to be able to give my body nutrients too, and nurturance as well. And so what could it look like where I can do both, right? I've been craving like a really good kale salad. So I'll honor that. And, after I eat my kale salad, maybe I'm still hungry. And so maybe I have some French fries alongside with that. I think so much of this is we live in such a world where it's like, if you're eating French fries and it's so bad, and if you're only eating kale salad, that's not realistic. So it's a duality of both, but so much of that takes checking in with your body. What I've noticed in the past couple of years as I've been learning to pick that phone back up and have that connection with my body is that sometimes it'll say, we really are craving a kale salad. And I'm eating that kale salad like it is a chocolate sundae. Like I'm like, oh, this is so good.
Yeah.
And it feels so good to eat this and it feels so good for me to take care of it. And I desire this kale salad. And as I'm eating it, I feel connected to myself. I feel so happy that I'm able to provide this to myself. And, when I'm finished, I might be like, okay, let me get a couple cookies because I want something sweet at the end, right? And it's being able to know that something sweet isn't going to take away from the nurturance and the connection and the call that I answered from my body. If anything, it's continuing to build that relationship where I can honor the both and be present and be rooted that I'm not inherently bad for eating the cookies. And I'm not on this pedestal of being good for just eating the salad.
That's so true, because we have really oftentimes pathologized pleasure in our society, where there's often some kind of shame associated with pleasure. So we've pathologized pleasure, and then on top of it, doubled down and put shame to it because of the pathology around it that we perceive. What happens is that we end up going down that rabbit hole of I'm bad, right? And then if we're doing that, then we're inherently saying that, oh, if I'm eating kale salad, for example, all the time, then I'm good. And that has nothing to do with pleasure. From what I'm hearing from you, these are just activities that society has deemed are either healthy or unhealthy for us, but it's not a judgment. Only we can decide what that sensation is, and through the wisdom of our bodies, if that actually is pleasurable. My body really craves what most people would consider healthy food, and I have noticed that that's when I feel best. I was eating healthy food before, by the way, and I gained a lot of weight recently in a way that did not feel pleasurable to me. It did up to a certain point. I was like, oh, I actually feel better with a couple extra pounds on me. And I kept eating like that. I was gaining more weight and I was getting really, really uncomfortable. Again, I was eating foods that were considered very healthy. But I started realizing that the timing that I was eating the foods, and it wasn't even the portions, but the timing that I was eating the foods and certain kind of foods were creating more inflammation in my body. So I started kind of figuring that out. And I did a complete overhaul. I'm a pescatarian, so I don't eat any kind of meats. And I still don't eat four-legged animals. But I was like, you know what? Maybe I should start introducing some chicken. Maybe I should start introducing some duck. And I did. And some of that extra weight came off of me, but it wasn't weight that was like, some weight can be good for me, right? But it was inflammatory kind of weight. It was like water weight and where my body was inflamed. So I started changing the way that I ate that was still considered what people on the outside would see as healthy. But the wisdom of my body said, it doesn't feel good to me and it doesn't feel pleasurable to me. But the point is that my body was telling me what I needed. I went against it. On the outside, it would look like, oh, that's a healthy kind of pleasure for you, but nobody can determine that except for me.
What made me really smile when you were talking is that your body said, hey, we don't really like that, right? It wasn't like this outwardly like, you are terrible. You are a bad person for giving this. How dare you do this? It was like, hey, we didn't really enjoy that. Can we try something else? And when you learn to develop that because it's wisdom, there's so much gentleness there, there's so much kindness within our bodies. Our bodies aren't saying, dare you be a piece of shit and eat, a tub of ice cream all day long. What it most likely says is, hey, we ate this tub of ice cream. This doesn't really feel good to us. Can we go on this walk tomorrow? Can we kind of hydrate a little bit more? Can we maybe eat something different? And it's being able to answer that call and really have that communication and being able, what I noticed, what you said is like, when I figured out what it was, I switched it up and I was so happy about it. It's like, oh, okay, well, that's the pleasure in it is the relationship that you have with the body and answering that call and working together. And now we're in sync and now we're feeling it. And now I can be at home in this space now at this point. I can settle in because we're working together here. I listen to you, you listen to me. We work together and that can be pleasure. That can be that piece that feels good to us to know we can listen to our bodies and our bodies listens to us.
It's so true because I ordered this meal. I sat down and ate it and I was like, why am I doing this? I was not answering the call in the moment. And then later, like 10 minutes later, I was listening to what my body was saying and it was saying, please don't do that again. And I said, I got you. Mm-hmm. I don't walk around feeling ashamed. Just like you said, I didn't feel ashamed of myself. I was like, I got you. And that's when we really start to become in communion with our bodies and our pleasure centers and our displeasure centers. So,
absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it really helps you form a relationship with pleasure in such a new way, because sometimes I really just want to sit in child's pose for an hour and a half and then we're going to cry. But sometimes it says go for a walk, and I'll go for the walk and then I end up kind of chatting with the trees and they're like, oh, we're so glad you came, we're so glad you're here. And our body says, oh, sunlight, movement. Oh, look at how beautiful, this pond is. Like, look at the way that the light glimmers, the sun glimmers off of this. Like this, in my experience, sometimes it's so pleasurable. It makes me want to cry. Because I'm like, I get to be, like you use that word communion, which I think is so beautiful. I get to be in communion with this space. I tell my clients, like, we are the same magic that is in nature. Like, we are created all of the same thing, and it's helped me be able to look at myself differently, because just as much as we look at the winter trees and we don't say, oh, they're so ugly. How dare they not have fruit? How dare they not have leaves? We trust that it's the season that it's in, and so if we can be able to trust that process externally, how do we take some of that magic and put it internally and say, the body's most likely in winter, like, yeah, we might put on a couple more pounds, because it's really cold. we need to kind of hunker down. And then in the spring comes, we'll say, let's start moving, let's start exploring, let's start doing these other things. And so that word communion is just really touching me, because I really do think it's such a sacred practice to be able to dive into that pleasure and learning what displeasure is, so that you create that relationship, that roadmap, that identity of pleasure for yourself.
Absolutely. Because when we're talking about displeasure, Corinne, I'm thinking about an episode I did recently with Nancy Levin on the shadow self. And you can't really know your light self, right? Unless you know your shadow self. You have to really know the dark parts and the light parts and all of these parts to truly authentically know who you are and show up fully.
Yeah.
And so acknowledging what's not pleasurable for us is just as important as acknowledging what is pleasurable, because that is really embracing ourselves and our whole human experience.
It makes me think about Dr. Schwartz's work in IFS and how we have these like manager parts, and the firefighter parts, and that they all have roles. And truly their roles, what they think they're doing is protecting us. Right. What they think they're doing is taking care of us, right? And so we all, the shadow self has a role. It's not evil. It thinks that it's doing its best. And so if we learn to work with it and nurture it and ask what it's needing, ask what might feel good to the shadow self, what might be pleasure to that, we can work with these parts of ourselves to, be able to show up as an authentic whole person. Because you're absolutely correct. There is no light without darkness. There is no darkness without light. And so how do we work with these pieces and learn a whole rounded piece of it, not just the good? Because if we work just in the good, that's fake, that's phony. If we work just in the bad, it's kind of like, well, we don't have to punish ourselves. But if we take the both and work with that, then we can learn, I'm slipping into this place that doesn't feel good. I have this knowledge now. My body's giving me these hints, and now I can work with it. Because like I said, we run and operate up here so much in our world that we do sometimes slip up and kind of stay up there. But when we take the hints and learn our own roadmap and learn the purposes of the overeating or the overdrinking or whatever it is, then we come back and say, okay, I'm sorry. I hear you now. What do you need me to do moving forward? What can I help you with moving forward?
Yeah, because pleasure is one of the things that tethers us here to this world. And when we can use what doesn't feel good as a guide and also sometimes as a motivator, right? For me, I don't want to feel bad. None of us want to move through the world feeling bad. Pain is inevitable and it's a realistic part of the human experience. But we don't want to sit in that space. We want things to help tether us here. And so when I think through the different types of belonging, the one that's really standing out is, where does nature live? And nature is one of those things, like you had mentioned, that we can go outside, we can take in the trees, we can take in the air, we can take in the warmth of it's a little hot right now in North Carolina, but we could take the warmth it's a little hot, but we could take in the warmth of the sun, the beauty of the sun, and the beauty of what it provides to us, and take all of that systemically in, almost like what you're saying in terms of like larger systems. Like the sun brings us crops, and the crops are a part of like the people that are the farmers that are bringing this food to us, and we could keep going on this large system that we're in. And when we connect with that, we can feel a sense of universal belonging, just being out in nature. Like, oh, I am part of this world and I'm overcome with the beauty of it. Or I'm just not even necessarily overcome, but I'm just sitting here in gratitude and feeling a part of this world and physically tethering myself to it by being outside and feeling my feet in the grass, which I know can feel icky for some people, but can feel so squishy and grounding for other folks.
Intention is everything, and recognition of that, and acknowledging like, hey, I might, yes, the grass might not feel great under my feet. So what I might do is I might put some shoes on, but I can still look up and I can look at a tree, or I can acknowledge, wow, like it's beautiful out here. Or, I can recognize my piece in this part, or maybe I feel small, maybe I feel big, maybe I'm just an observance, and I can just be still, and I can just be participatory in nature. I might not have to enjoy it or love it or talk to the trees or anything else, but I can just be out here and participate. And the intention of being a part of this is still recognition of the belonging that we have with it. It is still recognition of, that's the greater system in which we all operate in. And I think in some ways, it's the underground root work of systemic pleasure of, you might not, what is your body saying? Even if it's ambivalence, it's still, you're checking in and you're able to recognize, I'm not necessarily thrilled, but that is still communication. And that is still being able to recognize what's happening for you. So again, it's not the absolute highs or the absolute lows. It can be stillness, and it can be quiet, and it can maybe be ambivalence, and it can maybe just be like, that's okay too.
And the mundane aspects of life, which a lot of it can be, we avoid the mundane as much as we can in US society, especially. We tend to avoid it, but there's so much beauty in the mundane. For me, I've really been working truly just in the last few days, to be honest with you, on finding pleasure in the mundane, just the stillness of it. I mean, like, the beauty in being able to just sit here again in community with my own body, or in community with my partner who might be just sitting there quietly, or just sitting there with all the lights off in the middle of the day and, with the TV, no screens, nothing, and just looking out a window and having those moments. And I've been scheduling them more into my day, maybe in anticipation of meeting with you subconsciously. I don't know. And that's fine too. But I've been scheduling those moments more into my days where it's like, you know what? I'm going to put 15 minutes between these two meetings. Or I'm reconsidering what I consider a full day. So I have a rule now of like how many meetings and how much human interaction I have in one day, because I kind of have this kind of opposite thing, because from some people where it's like too much togetherness, too many people that I love meeting with, but I don't find as much pleasure in it when it's back to back to back to back to back to back to back. And so sometimes too much of a good thing can be too much. And so like finding diversity in the kind of pleasure that I have in my day is really important to me. Otherwise, it can feel like I ate too much. Maybe I shouldn't have had that big portion. Respectfully to all of you out there whom I love and who do see me on a regular basis, I'm probably enjoying your time more now because of scheduling more like different types of pleasure within my day.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things I really love about adding the layer of human design and astrology into it, is that it helps people work with what works best for them. So, in human design, there are types like, projectors and reflectors and manifestors where we can't be around people like that. We are, after a certain point in time, like our energetic layers are done and we have to check out. Whereas you have manifesting generators and generators who have a plethora of energy constantly ready to go. Now, that's a generalization because we could probably look at all the other aspects of your chart and get even further into that. But once you learn how to work with yourself instead of trying to put yourself in this box, then like you said, you say, okay, what I know I need is I need to schedule this a certain amount of time in a day, for myself. Like for me, I'm a manifester. So at the end of the day, I let my partner know I need an hour not to talk. After I've talked all day for a living, I need an hour not to move my jaw. And I need to go sit and just like taking a moment to kind of be with my breath and really feel what the air feels like on my skin in a dark room. Love that piece of it. But once I have that, then that is pleasurable to me because I feel recharged. I feel energized. And then so I get myself pleasure from that. Then I go and I interact with my partner through the day.
It gives so many more layers and richness to the ways that we connect in this world, whether to this world, to each other, to ourselves. It really is the belonging integration model manifested in many ways. It really, really is. And so I find it absolutely beautiful. And I thank you for bringing this concept to all of us. And I can't wait for the world to hear about it and to delve deeper into it, Corinne. I really mean that. I truly mean that.
It feels good to be seen right now. Like within my body, I feel really yummy and I feel really warm because it is something that, just came out here and came from my experience. And I said, like, I just want to talk about this. That's the sole purpose of it. I just want to talk about it. And I want to help other people be able to learn how to talk about it too and feel this good. And so I am excited to see where this takes me. I know it's just the kind of springboard and jumpstart, but I do think there's some really good substance here in continuing to encourage people to delve deeper into this wisdom of their body and to learn how to show up for themselves and find that pleasure identity, and find belonging there within themselves, like you said, within themselves, their community, to the world. I think there's so many different avenues and aspects that comes from being a pleasurable being and embracing that.
I feel like you should send me a therapy invoice. Thank you for doing that. So I'll ask you, Corinne, favorite question of the podcast. What does belonging mean to you?
Belonging to me is feeling, I'm going to use your word, in communion with my body, feeling in communion with my community, and then feeling in communion with this beautiful earth that we're living on, nature and spirits and connections that we have here. I think it's just being in communion with all that is, I would say, is what belonging means to me.
Belonging is communion with all that is. That is beautiful. That is beautiful. Thank you so, so much. I truly mean it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mona, to you. And love the work. Please continue to do what you do.
Back at ya. Thank you so much for joining us for today's episode. All of the show notes and links can be found on my website at drmonanour.com. That's drmonanour.com. Throughout most episodes, you'll hear me referring to the belonging model that I developed, which is represented by a belonging life map that helps you explore areas in your life where you feel more connection and areas where you might feel more isolation. And you can get a free copy of your own belonging life map on my website. Again, that's drmonanour.com. If you like the Belonging Reimagined podcast, please subscribe and consider leaving us a review. That can help more folks find us and keep more episodes coming. Until next time, I'm Dr. Mona. You're right where you belong.